Welcome to Imperfect but Improving the Pod. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Colin Hales. Dr. Colin Hales began his career as an electrical engineer focused on industrial automation. At 45, Colin returned to academia to complete a PhD in the origins of brain electromagnetism. His motivation was to begin realizing his ideas for a new kind of brain for machines that learns in the same way that natural fauna does. After nearly 20 years spent pursuing this passion, his ideas are beginning to gain traction. He has published a book on machine consciousness and has more than a dozen other publications. Colin's current research entails creating macroscopic prototypes to explore the basis for this new kind of chip technology. Dr. Hales, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I would love to start by asking about your background and how you came to be interested in the science of consciousness, this field of study, and machine consciousness in particular.
Go back to a movie called Forbidden Planet and 5-year-old Colin late night Friday TV in monochrome TV, 1962. There's a robot called Robbie, and I was transfixed by this machine. I'd never seen anything like that, and it stuck with me. And the fascination began, which stayed with me throughout my entire life. And I gravitated towards machines, machine complexity as an engineer, and ended up automating factories. So I spent 20 years making essentially big dumb robots in industry. That's what I now think of them as. But all throughout this, I was looking at the machines, wondering what if this collection of gear had any kind of intelligence, what would it be doing with this factory, for example? And I had a chance to change in around 2000. Long story, won't go into it. And so I arrived in about 2001 with fully formed ideas about a machine, the basis of a machine that would do this. And I thought, okay, here I am. I've got a chance to go down a path of my passion. What am I going to do? And I then went to look around the world for people who were thinking like me, because, it's like, right, whoever they are, I'm going to find them and I'm going to be their new best friend. And off we go, and I'll get these machines made. And I looked around the world, and I kept looking, and I kept looking, and I kept looking. And it turned out there was nobody there. And I've been looking for 20 years, waiting for somebody else to do this. And it turns out that myself and my colleague, Peter Kitchener, are actually the people to introduce it. And it's very, very strange. So here I am with an idea that has no footprint. And its connection to consciousness was the first thing I collided with, because consciousness wasn't really in my mind, in my thinking, but it became very obvious very early on, and that consciousness was a thing, and consciousness, the science of it, was just over 10 years old, and so it was very vociferous and early and noisy and demanded attention. And so it's taken me a very long time to retrofit the relationship between my ideas and what produces consciousness, so that we have a cogent idea of where the machines, where consciousness fits into the being of a machine that needs it in order to be intelligent.
Wow, that is a fascinating backstory. It really sounds like you you were ahead of your time in a couple ways. One being really thinking about what I think most people would recognize as AGI long before it was cool, and the intersection of that with a field of study that was just beginning to be really accepted as a serious empirical field of study in consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think before we really dive into your work, which is fascinating, I think we should introduce a good definition for consciousness itself, because as you say, it's a very deep field of study, and it's something that I think a lot of people have entangled with many other concepts like language and thought. So Would you mind giving us a good definition for consciousness that we'll be using when we continue with this discussion?
Well, there is no well written down, easy to find, short definition. But the shortest one that I can do to help the interested laity, the people that are interested in science but aren't in it, inside it, is just first person perspective. It's the subjectivity itself. Now, saying that is one thing, but being a scientific statement, it's very accurate in that I am referring only to that one thing. The word thought, the word feeling, the word awareness, the word sentience, there are 50 words you could use, all of which drag in first person perspectives. But so what the word in science, the word consciousness means, it's a reference to the first person perspective acquired by being some collection of matter. And for us, it's this matter here. The only evidence we have for a first person perspective is that of human subjective experience. Now, if you could replace this with a rock, which some people claim has already happened, we'll have an intuition that it's not like anything to be a rock. Now, I'm not claiming rocks have experiences, but a scientifically cogent statement as to the subjective life of a rock, to say that there is nothing it is like to be a rock, that would come from a highly mature science of consciousness, would be a scientific position and have authority. Currently, we can't make that statement. But imagine a rock for which it's a human engineered rock, and within that rock, we've engineered an inorganic form of the physics that generates the first person perspective in brains. There's no intelligence, there's no knowledge, there's no thinking, but there is an experience from the perspective of being the rock. If it had a transducer, it could have a complete visual system, visual experience, and a scene just as vivid and colourful as everything you and I are currently seeing. Apologies to the people with colour blindness. And yet, and I'm referring only to that visual experience. It has one experience and one experience only. And in completing the picture of our consciousness, it includes everything. It includes the subjective qualities of vision, audition, olfaction, gustation, haptic, touch, pressure, temperature, etc., etc. But not only that, it includes feelings of the form emotional content: mad, bad, sad, glad, guilt, blah, blah, blah. That's included. And it also includes the subjective qualities that you have when you are dreaming. So if you're a scientist in the science of consciousness, then from the perspective of that science, if you are asleep and dreaming, you have a first person perspective, and therefore you are actually conscious, which is not, it's not obvious to everyone.
Absolutely. I think you speak so clearly about how our only evidence, if you will, for the first person perspective is the one that we each enjoy as people, as individuals. And I think that is really what sets consciousness apart from other topics as something that is difficult to understand. We kind of glaze right over it because it's right here and so central to all of us. But you talked about the different qualia you can experience, emotions, mad, sad, glad, or touch, taste, gustation, the olfactory experience. These are all different experiences that we can have in our first person perspective, and they are driven by, often reduced in the rest of science, understandably, to the molecules, let's say, that produce the experience of smelling lavender once they enter your nostrils. But I think just for listeners that are maybe coming across this topic for the first time, it's really that experience of smelling that is the key bit here that we're talking about when we talk about consciousness and the ensuing problems that arise from it. Like, if we were to discover an entirely new molecule that has never been smelt before, we could know everything about the structure of that molecule and still have no knowledge about what the experience of that smell would be
Yeah.
like subjectively, qualitatively, from our
Yeah,
first person perspective.
that difference, that distinction is now currently called the hard problem of the science of consciousness. There, if you open up a brain and looked at the brain while it is delivering the experience of red to that brain, you do not see the experience. You see brain material in the act of delivering it in the first person perspective of the material. And it's that shift in perspective, which is the hardest thing for the science to come to grips with, because we are trained from puppy scientists to exclude it from everything that we are saying. If we describe the brain from a third person perspective, we're talking about neurons and astrocytes and all the measurements entailed with acquiring its properties that we measure. None of those properties contact or would even suggest the existence of what it is like to be that brain material. And if the viewer would like to habituate that distinction, they'll go a long way and possibly further than many scientists in becoming comfortable with it. It's a difficult thing to treat something that's absolutely everything that it is to be human, and yet we render it so invisible in science. And it's been like that since day one. And I parachuted myself into that at the
Right into the
beginning.
hole at the heart of science.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an orphaned hole. That's what I describe it as for me, is that I didn't, in my ignorance, coming out of industry without any configuration that's come from the received views, I parachuted myself into an orphaned zone between four different sciences, and I was on my own and I didn't know. And it's taken me all this time to figure out why it is that I was so alone, and then begin to drag the four different disciplines: neuroscience, physics, computer science, and philosophy to a certain extent, and mathematics, all sort of managed to make this empty position in science a thing. It's rare in science, but in this particular one, this orphan, I've worked out after much thought, to have resulted from the moment of the first creation of the digital computer.
Mm,
There was a schism that occurred, and a moment in reinteraction with neuroscience in modeling that vacated that area and left it empty. And it just stayed that way like a kind of fossil. And it started in the 1950s. So that was where Colin found himself, firstly in an untraveled, no footprints on the beach position, and no way to even talk about it because I was untrained. So I had to train myself, and now to train others in order to see it. And I'm finally able
right.
to outreach a bit to people like
Mm.
yourself.
Well, what do you think was the turning point in the study of consciousness when it became a topic that could be respectably talked about amongst scientists without there being a taboo around even bringing up the issue of this first person perspective or the hard problem of consciousness?
Yeah, consciousness has actually been studied on and off. In the main, it's associated with cognitive science, and its study was hidden. People didn't actually apply for money with the word consciousness in it. They were studying cognitive science, and even cognitive science as a soft science was treated as a bunch of charlatans at the beginning, talking about nothing by the physical sciences. So buried underneath the surface appearance of cognitive science were people who attended to consciousness. But if you mentioned it in a seminar back in the 60s or whatever, people could literally be seen getting up and walking out of the room. It was a career limiting move to actually engage it at all. And it wasn't until 1990 and a Nobel Prize winner, Francis Crick, and combined with another now well-known neuroscientist by the name of Christoph Koch, wrote a seminal work which stepped over the line in a cogent way and brought the science of consciousness into the physical sciences. Very significant moment, and that was in 1990. So here's me in 2000 with a 10-year-old science to play as my playground. And then it became okay to apply for money. But even now, after 30 years, 33 years or whatever it is, if you, in applying for money, you have to really be careful in using the word consciousness. It's still tainted with the original no-go zone, taboo. In some people's mind, especially in more conservative areas like neuroscience, which is where I'm at in the Department of Physiology and Anatomy at the University of Melbourne. But as time goes on, it's becoming, um, a bandwagon that you can jump on now and still be pretty safe.
It's really
That's the kind of
fascinating.
status.
It's really fascinating as an outsider that's obviously first, I would say, really learned about the hard problem not long before 2020, when it's a very developed field with multiple competing theories to attempt to get at some causality there, and really, yeah, decades now of science behind it as to why it was so taboo and why it wasn't just the most interesting question that science could answer. As we know that there's these physical properties of matter, and yet nothing about the physical universe implies that if you arrange matter in particular ways, it should generate a first-person perspective, or there should be something it is to be this new arrangement of matter versus this other arrangement of
Some
matter. And
other,
so
yeah.
as a yeah, as a layperson coming into this, it's absolutely fascinating how this wasn't one of the most interesting things anyone that was interested in the brain could have studied. Um, but great that it has entered the scientific
Yeah.
foray for sure.
Yeah, I consider myself very lucky to have arrived at a moment where a science was literally transferring from just philosophy essentially into and it came down over a period of about 100 years from outside science in philosophy. Then it started in psychology with William James, and it's gradually worked its way down through social, down into cognitive science. And then the magic step in 1990 from cognitive to neuroscience, and then into cell biology, and down deeper into molecular. And now finally, I think I'm helping to make the final step into physics. Many people have tried that so far, but my approach is one of those, and I'm hoping that it might actually get the traction, and it seems to be getting traction. But what happened in 1990 was a bit of a sleight of hand that made the science tolerable. And if you characterize the science, it's called, the thing that they actually began was called the neural correlates of consciousness. And those words are very carefully chosen because they're not actually claiming to explain consciousness, and yet they're doing science on it. So if a scientist can become predictive of a report of consciousness, it looks like normal science. Right?
This
So
is the so-called easy problem of
yeah,
consciousness, if you will.
yeah, it's allied to that, but yeah, essentially they made it easy by a sort of a methodological sleight of hand, where no, don't worry, we're not actually claiming to have solved the actual origin of consciousness, but we can get to things that we can reliably and repeatably claim to be correlated with the production of subjective qualities. Redness only happens when you arrange signaling that does this dance. And if you do that, then you get money. You
Right,
can
right.
get paid to
They'll
do
give
that.
you funding to
Yeah,
analyze
absolutely.
brain
Yeah,
patterns of activity and correlate them with reported experiences in a person.
yeah.
How far has how far has the quote unquote the easy problem of consciousness or the neural correlates of consciousness approach made it? And really with a focus on like the empirical question of linking certain parts of the brain and patterns of activity to consciousness and reported experience.
It's been an absolutely invaluable process to embark on, and pretty much mandatory. And it has taught us everything we currently know about the origins of consciousness. But the structural anomaly in the science that was there in 1990, the correlates of idea, is finally entering its end game, where there are around about 23 different uh, theories of consciousness, all of whom are justified empirically with these ideas about correlates, and the lack of an actual connection to an originating mechanism for a subjective experience is actually biting down hard right now. We're doing level at the moment. There's a paradigm where different theories are competing with each other to see which one wins. But in the end, even if there is a winner, they still haven't explained the thing. So if you said, I've got this theory of consciousness, and then someone said, okay, let's build a machine with that consciousness, it wouldn't prescribe um, what it is to do. They can't tell you what you need to build. I've actually asked Tononi, who's the origin of the
IIT.
well-known, IIT theory of consciousness, and I asked him, if a machine was made on IIT principles, what would that machine be? And he said, I don't know, but what I do know is it's not a computer. So, and that's just one of 23. So if you go down the most recent list, which is 23 for a paper by Anil Seth and Tim Bain, they listed out the 23. And the one that I find myself involved with is actually generally eschewed by everybody, and it's the electromagnetic field theory, is number 22, and that was the first time it actually got mentioned in the list. It's been that
Progress.
unpopular. Yeah, yay! And that happened right as I was publishing a paper. I published a paper with Marissa Erickson in 2023 about electromagnetism's ability to leap across what they now call the explanatory gap of the hard problem. And right just before it published, they published this list, and for the first time, electromagnetism was explicitly mentioned. And so I managed to get the manuscript edited to reflect that. So that's actually free online if anyone wants to look it up. It's not an easy read. Sorry about that. But you'll find the essence of everything that we're saying here today is encoded in those words.
Sorry, I'll put the title of that and your other publications in the show notes
Yeah,
yeah,
that'd be great.
direct readers there.
It's starting to finally get cited. In a couple of years since it's been out, it's sort of got 40, 40 odd citations, which is, in this area, it's quite an achievement. So I'm looking forward to that becoming a little more well known in
Definitely.
time.
So I'm interested as again someone that is coming to this without seeing the journey of it evolve as a science and really thinking overly naively and simplistically that okay, if our brain is the one data point, if you will, that we have, that there is consciousness in the universe, there is an experiential quality to certain arrangements of matter. Um, then clearly something that's occurring physically in the brain is the origin of that. And multiple um, there's multiple forces of physics that are occurring in the brain and multiple elements. So some arrangement of those that physical substrate is generating consciousness in our first person experience. Um, given that fact, what are in and feel free to grossly summarize because this is a huge question. The different attempts to explain how uh, how consciousness arises, whether it's an inherent property of matter, like spin or charge, versus something that quote unquote emerges from complexity, the way that, maybe the fluidity of water emerges from the movement of H2O molecules. Um,
Yeah.
I have, my own intuitions, but I'm really curious to hear how you would direct listeners to think about attempting to even understand that explanatory gap, if not, some of the theories that attempt to kind of describe what could possibly
Yeah.
bridge that gap.
Yeah. We're really talking about the so-called hard problem, where a scientific account of some aspect of properties of a brain is somehow supposed to produce, by being those properties, you suddenly create this vivid and unified set of subjective qualities. And you've mentioned several of the ways people have approached it, and you've also and each one I could go for an hour on. So it's very difficult to pick uh, something that is obviously helpful. The two things you just mentioned, one thing is emergence. There are two flavors of emergence, one of which is familiar to scientists, in very familiar in the sense that if you go up the hierarchy of matter, starting from subatomic to atomic particles, nucleus and electrons, you're going up to molecules, so that's atoms obviously, molecules, and then collections of molecules, and then collections of molecules, to organs, to organisms. Each of those steps is a descriptive jump, and scientists position themselves at each layer, and that identifies them as a scientist. You're a physicist, you're a chemist, you're a cell biologist, you're a sociologist, all the way up. And at that layer, you can do detailed science, and you can describe very formally processes that go on. And it's actually the job of the scientist to explain the emergence that transitions from one layer to the other. A classic example that it's only relatively recently been figured out is the emergent quality of the flight of the bumblebee, unexplained until it was realized that turbulence in the special qualities of the wings was sufficient to allow the bee to fly. Otherwise, they couldn't explain how the bee could fly. And transitions like this, which involved enough knowledge of the underlayer that facilitated a prediction of a property at a slightly higher level, bumblebees' wings and then flight. That transition is weak emergence. And it's the job of a scientist to actually transition these weakly emergent steps. And then there's strong emergence, where no amount of description of the layer you're in predicts what is obviously happening as a result of that layer doing what it does. And consciousness is one of those. And it's deeply problematic for the reason that consciousness is the first thing we throw away with scientific method. Right? We have this concept called observer independence. And we think we're rendering our descriptions of the world independent of the observer. And we actually demand that the subjective qualities of being a scientist actually include the contents that is the scientific evidence that is required to explain things in nature. And we render all our descriptions independent of any individual scientist. So any scientist can validate that the rules that you're proposing, the laws of nature that you're proposing, are predictive of nature. And it's very successful, brilliant. Third person science is 2,000 years old and absolutely brilliant. It gave us the technology we're using at the moment. But it doesn't predict what it is like to be the stuff. And that's the strongly emergent property that David Chalmers described so well in the 90s, and that is still untouched by all of the science that has gone on.
Everything you just said, I think, captures so well why consciousness can be called the whole at the heart of science. Because, as you say, we remove the observer to do science. We collect data and measurements, but it's actually not until those measurements and data are observed by a scientist and enters their consciousness, because everything we can ever observe or experience is by definition our consciousness, right?
Yeah, you
It's the
must
sum
be.
total of our.
I'd like the listener to be able to clearly distinguish between observation and measurement. Now, the measurement is out there in the world where we've got a probe, it's sticking into something. The measurement is happening out there. But the results of that observation are actually something that occurs in what's called the contents of the consciousness of the scientific observer. And without that, the passage of that information through a scientist, you have no science. I said a minute ago, we're rendering our laws of nature independent of the observer. What we're not rendering it independent of is observation itself. And the physics of the scientific observer is actually the thing that the science of consciousness is trying to explain. And the science itself presupposes the existence of an observer to do that. So there's this circularity involved. And I wrote a whole book, this book, disconnecting to just decouple the two, those two aspects. What would a scientist be doing if he was describing the universe in a way that predicted a scientific observer? Right? None of the laws of nature we've ever produced, even the science of consciousness, actually predicts the nature and present existence of a scientific observer capable of doing science. And when you examine scientists, you start to, if you treat scientists as a subject, like they're a natural phenomenon like anything else, they're not magic, and you can study them scientifically, and that's what I did. And guess what? Scientists do not like being lab rats, I've discovered. They don't like having their very own methods questioned and applied to themselves. And I think I've managed to use the scientist, the process of doing science, quite helpfully in addressing a way of broaching the hard problem that doesn't exist in the literature at all. Scientists are not trained. I mean, I've been through it. I did a PhD in this. And during that whole training, you never broach the subject of the scientific observer as distinct from measurement. But boy, are you punished if you don't make up an experiment that requires information passed through the first person of a scientist. If you can't do that, your stuff is rejected. So we're simultaneously demanding that consciousness be used and then making sure we throw consciousness away into being a scientist. So is it any wonder we're in trouble? It's profoundly problematic for scientists, and it's unique. Nowhere else in science does this happen, and it's actually, to me, the science of consciousness is actually the science of scientists. It's how in its essence, it's how we explain how we can do what we do, and if you examine the literature, you never, there's a thing called meta-science. If you go, there's even a journal called Meta-Science. You will find detailed accounts of the results of scientific behavior. What you will not find is an empirical study of how we do it as scientists. Like the cohort of observed, you actually have to observe scientists being scientists. And the opinion of scientists about what they do is irrelevant. Once you objectify scientific behavior, you can't ask the scientists what they think they're doing. You actually have to report what they're doing. And I did that in that book I just waved at you and wrote down a law of nature of scientific behavior. Widely ignored. That's all I can say. But nevertheless, just as
Well,
valid as any other law of nature. So it's been fun.
I'm really interested in this bit of your writing where you really you talk about the fact that observations have to pass through a scientific observer to be entered into the literature and for science to be done. And I do want to touch on that more in a bit. I think it has a lot of interesting connections to um, the rise of LLMs as we see them today and questions of
Yeah,
intelligence and how consciousness and intelligence are and are not related. But before we dive into that. I'm curious about uh, your your intuitions about the hard problem when it comes to. So you touched on what makes the strong or radical emergence of of consciousness different from the weak emergence we see in other sciences where we
yeah,
explain yeah the flight of a bumblebee
yeah,
in terms of the particles underneath its wing and those fluid dynamics of the air. But when it comes to the hard problem, as a layperson, I hear two different accounts. I hear one is that it is an emergent property, however mysterious, of information processing or a certain degree of connectedness between systems, and those none of those explanations ever sound very intuitive and straightforward. Or there's the incredibly radical panpsychist explanation that
yeah,
um, consciousness must be an inherent property of matter, just like mass and spin and charge, and if you get enough of it in enough arrangements, then somehow that aggregates into this first person experience, which is
yeah,
still very not intuitive and kind of just makes consciousness a brute fact that cannot be explained by preceding
yeah,
causes, in my opinion. You know,
yeah.
makes it a property of the universe. What are your intuitions and thoughts on those
Oh,
explanations?
well, there are so many aspects to this. Firstly, I'd like to step one little bit back into to the previous conversation and close out an aspect to this, which I find really important. If you take away the subjective experiences of a human, then that human is essentially in a dreamless sleep or a coma, experientially. There is nothing it is like to be you. And the hard problem is a scientific account that that is cogently predicting what matter would be doing if it was supplying a subjective experience. And the things that you mentioned in terms of emergence, imagine there is a mature science of consciousness. It predicts a scientific observer. It predicts the subjective qualities and why they're unified in the magical way they appear to be. In that science, the strong emergent part of it would disappear and become weak emergence, just like every other science. And it would be boring. Yeah, of course. The question is, what kind of description of nature would you be supplying where that happened? Because that's the place that the scientists have to go. And they're not going there. Oh, okay. Having said that, they are going there, but they don't realize it at the moment. There are an emerging group of people that are actually carrying out the kind of science that I think will perform that magical job. Um, one of the most famous of whom is Stephen Wolfram, and the less famous one would be Tononi Group. I know that I would deny they've explained consciousness, but Tononi and Stephen Wolfram don't realise that the kinds of descriptions of the universe that are required to explain a scientific observer and subjectivity, describing the universe in those terms is not the same description of how the universe appears to a presupposed observer, which is the thing we reward. So,
Hmm.
um, so the explanatory gap, which we've already touched upon, is a way of requires us to take a position as a scientist where it makes sense that makes a sense of the universe in a way that is predictive of subjectivity. And none of the things we've been doing so far do that, except for these people who are touching on this area and don't realize that they're actually in a completely different descriptive domain. These are words that are probably going to just confuse the user and confuse the viewer, sorry.
So
But
to make sure to clarify and just make sure I'm following because I think I am in a mature science of consciousness that would explain that would turn strong emergence into weak emergence, we would be able to look at, let's say, a new pattern of brain activity that no one has ever experienced, and with this complete science you would be able to tell me, oh Ian, if I stimulate your brain to have this pattern of activity, then you will have an experience like this.
yeah, or conversely, you might have a machine,
No,
and you, as with the same exact same mechanism of explanation, you'd be able to formally specify whether that machine is capable of having a first person experience. So there's two sides to this: the
right.
natural and the artificial, and yeah, very important.
Got it. That makes
Um,
sense. But if I'm following, then the thing that still remains that you're implying that Tononi and crew are closing in on from one direction is the why of
yeah,
the the why behind this pattern of brain activity would actually, you know,
yeah,
lead to this experience that we, with a mature science, could say for sure is happening in a machine or a human.
yeah, yeah. And until a reconciliation is engaged where we're challenging the fundamentals of scientific behaviour, this issue, the hard problem, will not go away. That's my prediction about the way the science is going to evolve. So you've got a requirement to take a perspective on the universe that involves describing the universe in a way that is not the way we normally describe it. Um, and but currently people are engaged in that new way of describing it, but don't realize that it's different from the normal one, and they're using normal evidence to try and justify it and failing, and they don't realize that in order to, in my particular slant on where the subjective qualities come from, is that these new descriptions have to predict the electromagnetism that forms the basis for signaling in the brain. So in this new description, if they can identify electromagnetism, then the two views converge and the two different descriptions can be reconciled with each other, both valid, and equally and jointly joined at the hip in an explanation of a scientific observer. That's where the explanation of science comes from. So, and all of these things to me are groundwork that I've covered by necessity because I couldn't understand why we weren't engaging with descriptions of the universe in a way that was productive. So I sort of dived deep and found what was going on. But in the end, for me, I just want to build my chips. And I found myself unpacking descriptions of the entire universe in order to figure out why everyone else was saying I couldn't do it.
You want to build conscious machines, but you've had to wade through decades of
Yeah,
confusion around consciousness first.
absolutely. Absolutely. And now at the moment, I have the luxury. I've sort of wandered around this empty beach of ideas and put together what it looks like to me the form of the solution is. And it's reinforced my ideas. In my original ideas that I turned up with seem to be in unity with this approach. So I can go into the lab and start building devices, which I'm doing, with all that substructure of explanation set aside, just knowing that if I build these things like that, then I'm exploring the logical consequences of the new science to come, which will actually explain or solve the hard problem. And someone else can then go around and reconnect everything up and connect the dots. I don't think I'll be around to actually see it, but that's my hope. There's definitely an explanation there. It's just waiting for people to
Right.
connect all the dots.
Before we dive into your designs to, I would say, build machine intelligence, this new chip design that leverages, I would say, more of the physical phenomena occurring in the brain, if that's fair to say, than a
Yeah.
typical circuit board does. Um, Before we cover that ground, could we shift gears a tiny bit to talking about why it is, in your view, unlikely that something that is displaying signs of intelligence, like, let's say, the frontier model LLMs of today, is unlikely to have a rich first person experience or be conscious, given um, what seems logical to you about what it is in the brain that is that is generating conscious experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Once again, there's a flood of approaches here. The basic the fundamental reason is that the physics of a computer is not the physics of the brain at all. So it's the physics that originates. There are all sorts of beliefs that people have erected. The most common one is that the brain is an information processor, and the word information does a huge amount of work in leading to a conclusion that just managing or manipulating information can create something equivalent to a brain. Whether or not it's a subjective quality or not doesn't actually figure very highly, but the implicit claim is that consciousness is irrelevant to intelligence, and that you can eliminate consciousness or not deal with consciousness just by processing information. And that underlies the entire edifice of the current approach to intelligent machines. And the there's it's kind of embarrassing to watch the extent to which this belief system is dominating the science. Formerly, if you examine scientific pathologies, you've got all sorts of you've got scientific delusions of various flavors and pathological sciences. There's one in the middle that was identified by Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, called cargo cult science. And in fact, I would describe the science as it currently is as a cargo cult. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of a cargo cult at all.
No, this is my first time. Please
All
educate
right.
me.
There is a very famous paper, you can find it quickly. Just Richard Feynman, Feynman, cargo cult, and you'll find a famous speech that he made to undergrads or something back in the 70s. I think it was the 70s, where he defined cargo cult science. So if you can imagine the natives in New Guinea in the Second World War observing um, the 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 operation of an airport in the jungle, and magic happened to them. They cleared land and they put lights and they had a radio tower, and the gods delivered all sorts of amazing stuff. And then the war ended, and the natives said, "Oh, gee, let's get some of this magic going." And so they actually cleared land and they put coconut lights along it, and they built a tower with palm tree antenna, and they went through all the affectations of the process, which invited the gods' machines to come and deliver all the wonderful things. And so you can imagine the mistake they had to make in order to believe that the consequences of their behavior would result in the things that occurred during the Second World War.
Right.
And that perfectly matches what we're doing at the moment. We've got 75 years, I think it's 75 now, of belief that manipulating information will result in intelligence. 75 years non-stop, where three generations of humans have picked up from each other this belief system that that's what you do to make intelligence. And at the same time, that belief is actually an unproven hypothesis that started in the
You have
1950s.
a you have a great analogy, and such a pithy line from it. Like, no one expects the flight simulator to take off and start flying
Yeah,
just because it's
absolutely. Uh,
simulating
it,
flight.
yeah. There, This is just one way that I have found of explaining the oddly structured science. There is another one. I wish I could share it. Basically, you can divide science into its activity of observation into three columns. I'll try and put them the right way around from your perspective. So this one would be, sorry, this one on your left would be nature itself. You observe nature, you come up with formalism is predictive of the behavior of nature. Great. And then in the middle, you have a column which I call the simulant, where you are numerically exploring formalisms and making predictions about nature. And those two things, when they coincide, they give you the basis for laws of nature that actually work. And there's also another thing you can do, and that is you can make an artificial version of the original nature. And that column I call the replicant. So you've got nature, simulant, replicant. And those three observational contexts are the fundamental basis of the operation of science. You're in one of those. The Wright brothers built flying machines to essentially create artificial flight based on very primitive formalisms surrounding lift examined in a wind tunnel. And you can go down from, that starts with flight. Fire is the same. In fact, everywhere in science, no matter where you go, so they're describing nature, the natural phenomenon, there are these three observational contexts. And if you list them out, let's say fire, flight, the heart, the stomach, and the kidney, and you go all the way down the list and finally arrive at the brain. And if you get to the brain, what you find is that you've got your nature, and you've got your formalisms, that is the simulant, blah, 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 all the way down. And you've also got replicants, artificial fire, artificial flight, artificial stomach, artificial kidney, and you get to the brain and you go, artificial brain, right? So here you have a computer in the middle computing formalisms, and you've got a claim that the computing of a formalism is a brain. And it doesn't happen anywhere else in science. In fact, that hole
Right,
that I
right.
described is actually where I parachuted myself into in 2000. And it's still empty. Actually, no, that's the wrong statement. There is actually very recently one example in a biological version of a replicant has been created, and they think it's a computer. It's so frustrating. So if you can imagine, all I'm doing is building an inorganic version of, just like an inorganic kidney, an inorganic stomach, an inorganic, artificial fire is literally burning. Artificial flight is literally flying. I'm actually building something that is braining, literally with the same physics. And that is the thing that is missing. And it's really weird when you turn up talking to roomfuls of computer scientists and you say, I'm building an artificial brain, but I'm not using a computer of any kind, including analog or neuromorphic. Those things are computers, and they sit in the central column, the simulant. They're examining models of properties of the nature. They're not replicating the actual nature. So all I'm doing is doing what sciences have done all along, and I'm doing it in the case of the brain. And I've been the one who's been pushed aside when all I'm doing is actually normalizing a broken science. It's really, I didn't sign up for this, but that's the journey I got. So
Well, this
it's
seems like
quite
a
remarkable.
great point to shift into that work. But I think to someone not as familiar with it, obviously, I think it would be nice to kind of formalize what you just said about there's multiple physical phenomena going on in the brain. One of which I think is most of what most people think of when they think of brain activity, which is axonal spiking, right? Neuron to neuron synaptic transmission. But there's many other um, types of electromagnetic effects going on in the brain. Could you talk a little bit about what those are and how a model of the brain that only looks at neuron to neuron connections is kind of doomed to fail to replicate everything that's going on in the brain?
Yeah, it doesn't. It's doomed to replicate everything, but it doesn't mean it's not useful. Okay, well, there is that mechanism of signaling. It's centered on the outer surface of all neurons, and it's a signaling mechanism that propagates in the plane of the membrane. So, if you imagine a surface, and there's a moment we call the spike that happens, and that travels down and eventually goes into the axon and goes to the next neuron and so forth. And that's the familiar spiking that everyone's that models everywhere have been focused on. In the last 10 to 15 years, there has been identified a second important signaling mechanism, and it actually originates in the same physical phenomena that generates the other longitudinal, the traveling wave that goes down the surface and up the surface, actually, of the neurons. And it has a name that's quite old. It was named in the 20s, I think, in war. A problem of coupling in damaged soldiers, nerve couplings. And it's called ephaptic coupling. So if you can imagine, there's an electromagnetic phenomenon happening in the membrane that is like a telegraph repeater station that travels along. But when it does the physical phenomenon happens, electromagnetic fields are actually produced by the same mechanism that travel directly by line of sight at the speed of light through the tissue, impacting adjacent neurons. And that's the signaling mechanism which doesn't appear anywhere in any of the mainstream models. And it certainly doesn't appear in any of the original abstractions that led to large language models. You know, all of the adaptive mechanisms of learning are a very, very highly reduced form of that signaling. And it's not actually real-time signaling at all. So it's so different from the brain, you can't really compare them. So that signaling mechanism is just gone. It doesn't exist in any of the mainstream models. And the actual influence in space, these fields are extraordinarily weak. And if you can imagine one neuron firing and there's a passage in space where this physical phenomenon is going bang, 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 bang down the membrane, producing a field that impacts the triggering site of an action potential in another neuron. Now, in 1 cubic millimeter of cortical tissue, you've got 50,000 neurons all firing at the same time. And if you have one neuron that's poised right on the verge of firing, and a field comes and alters the threshold of that firing so that the moment of firing is advanced or retarded based on the field system in the actual membrane where the thresholding is occurring, you can have extraordinarily small field effects that lead to substantial changes in the timing of the signals elsewhere. And that is rapidly recruited by the entire network. It's amplified. It's like an unstable equilibrium that's disrupted in one direction. And when the whole system resonates, you get reinforcement by thousands of cells. And the field system of those thousands of cells can be significant and alter the timing in another neuron. And that's the signaling mechanism which is missing. But the crucial question has nothing to do with this. The crucial question is, what is it like to be that signaling mechanism? Because that's what we do. And that's the one that is missing. And if you go back into my work, I mean, I don't publish much, I rest in obscurity generally. But in 2014, I published a paper in the Journal of Integrative Neuroscience. I think it's free. I don't know anymore. In section 6 of that paper, I actually outline a mechanism by which you can look at the firing moment in a membrane and take a subjective and an objective view of the exact same phenomenon. And the mechanism is not some fabrication of, some mental projection. It actually does this, and it literally means that you can actually take a view of the exact same physics phenomenon from a first and third person perspective. And as far as I know, there's nowhere else in the literature where anyone's actually been able to do that. So it's kind of, I think it's kind of important, and it's actually the central thing. It's the central mechanism that my devices are exploring. When I'm actually
Can
literally
you?
building a large piece of membrane in the lab. Sorry,
I
go on.
I again, as someone that isn't as well acquainted with the various intricacies of the different theories of consciousness, it strikes me as odd that um, they don't more often take into account um, every aspect of electromagnetism, every physical force
Yeah,
that is occurring in the brain, um, as necessary or a requirement, or at least something you can't immediately discard without a lot of evidence.
yeah,
Um, and
yeah.
your writing makes it clear that you don't do that, and that's, if I'm not to put words in your mouth, why it seems like EM field theories of consciousness are your preferred flavor of explanatory
Yeah.
theory.
I'm not
Um,
alone in this, by the way. There are a bunch of work of researchers around the world who recently sort of formed a bit of a nucleus of activity, examining all our different aspects of electromagnetism, because in and of itself, it's fairly large. But you're right in the sense that the ignoring it has become the main game. And I can actually pinpoint the moment where it happened. It was in 1952, in the work of Hodgkin and Huxley, when they were working on the squid giant axon, and they did Nobel Prize winning work of genius. I don't know how they did it. It was before they even knew there were ion channels in membranes. And
wow.
they actually created an electrical equivalent circuit of the propagation of the membrane, the action potential down the axon of the squid giant axon. It's like a 1 centimeter thick nerve, so you could stick probes in it and measure things really well and control the concentrations. Brilliant, absolutely. That's a work. It blows me away what they did. But anyway, an electrical equivalent circuit is the culprit, right? An electrical equivalent circuit of a model of an electrical phenomenon throws away the original phenomenon and replaces it with the physics of the circuit elements. So in the case of this
Hmm.
particular thing, there are circuit elements called a capacitor and some time varying resistors and other electrical things, each of which has an electromagnetic field associated with it, but it's associated with it in a way which is very mathematically describable. And the description doesn't involve contact with the electromagnetic fields at all. And yet, there's different fields, because of the degeneracy in the equations, make a prediction of voltages which they measured. So they actually became highly predictive of voltages by throwing away the original physics. And that discarding of the original physics was the moment where we lost the connection with electromagnetism. And it's only recently we're starting to see electromagnetism forcing its way back, saying, deal with me, deal with me, deal with me. And I just turned up in 2000 saying, if you want this signal, then you do this. And I didn't create an electrical equivalent circuit. I actually created an inorganic version of the actual physics. It's really quite strange. In the lab, I'm built the central device that's involved in this 70-year-old model is a capacitor. And the capacitor is in a sense, it's a device that partitions charge, and at a key moment, it actually shorts out two plates, and current travels between them. And so I just replicate that. And lo and behold, what it does is it produces an electric field and a magnetic field that projects outside the capacitor just briefly. And you can put these devices next to each other and they can link, or you can put them in parallel and they can link. It's just antenna theory. It's it's not propagating in the normal way of radio waves, but it's called quasi-static electromagnetism. But the coupling is real, and so um, that reintroduction of replicating the actual physics is the central thing that is behind the alteration to the approach to AI.
All right, so I'm really interested in the design of your chips that you're working on. How is it that you construct them in such a way that they aim to replicate the same forces that are occurring in the human brain or a brain?
Yeah, so we're talking essentially a chip that is inorganic brain tissue. Okay, so the physics that is being replicated, I don't use the word emulate or simulate or any of those other words because it's not what I'm doing. I'm replicating the physics the same way the Wright brothers replicated the physics of flight. So the chips in the end, fully developed, and I'll never see them, are three-dimensional. And I think the very early versions will be planar in 2 dimensions, but to get things going, maybe even one-dimensional in the end, just a line of connected devices. But imagine 2D slices laid on top of one another. And as the technology gets better for fabrication, they'll be able to build fully three-dimensional chip structures that actually have cells on them that adapt and behave and do everything that neurons do, including rewiring themselves and moving. I know that doesn't sound right. Physically, nothing moves, but the function can move from one cell to another, and the wiring between the cells can uh, can migrate with it, and the linkages between one cell and another can come and go just like they do in here. It needs a process analogous to sleep in order to be managed properly. But I am currently building a 20,000 times scale version of just one cell. And it took me 2 years to learn how to build the equivalent of a piece of membrane with a hole in it. I know it sounds ridiculously simple and mechanical, but that's what is required in order to generate the exact physics phenomenon that's doing it in the brain. It's pretty simple, and I just can't believe that it hasn't been done before, but it's just the way it is. And so I was looking for someone who was doing that way back, and no one does it. The first thing that gets thrown away, and before you even start, I want to do AI, I throw all the physics of the brain away. Oh,
And so,
it's not there.
uh,
That's the way everyone approaches it today. Yeah,
um,
it's very odd.
could you describe the structure of the chips in a bit more detail? So, let's say someone with some familiarity of circuit boards could begin to
Yeah,
understand what it is that you're building at 20x scale or 20,000 times scale.
yeah. The physical dimensions of what the physics in the brain operate at the scale of nanometers. So that's a thousandth of a millionth of a meter. The thickness of a neural membrane is 5 nanometers. Now, when I first started this, chip manufacturers couldn't do that. Now they can do that. They build devices that operate at that level. So there's nothing stopping us doing this for real. So if you can imagine chip elements, just like the chip elements that we have now, the same scale, but mechanically or physically look different. They're just transistors, and they're switching currents across between A and B, just like everywhere else, except instead of throwing away the coupling between the transistors, which is the first thing designers are required to do to stop them coupling with each other, it's built into the design tools to stop them coupling with each other. What does the brain? The brain can't do that, and it actually relies on coupling, electromagnetic coupling between devices. And so that's what I'm restoring, and that the chip technology that we've got can actually do it. But it requires a change in thinking. The devices, there are capacitors that get built into neuromorphic chips that operate at that scale. And so we're quite able to build capacitors at that level
And
and
sorry, could
switch them.
you define neuromorphic versus neuromimetic?
Right. Well, neuromorphic chips, they actually got conceptualized and the beginnings built right around the time of Christoph Koch and Francis Crick in 1990, 89, 90. And they are actually, again, they're actually an analog computer. So they're predicting the voltage by using capacitors. So that the electrical equivalent circuits gets literally reified on the chip as opposed to thrown away and computationally modeled with the equations of the components. So it's highly parallel. So you actually put devices on the chip and you connect them with each other. So they're signaling to each other. But the physics that's being examined is actually a model, again, just like Hodgkin and Huxley. It's a model of the signaling between neurons based on the replication of the components of a model. So it's actually a computer, and everyone doing neuromorphic, it's actually called neuromorphic computing. Right. And that is highly developed now, and there are large chips that do this, and it's a very productive and advanced approach. But in the end, it's actually throwing the original physics away. They actually do not want the electromagnetic fields to be produced and coupled to adjacent cells. They actually, again, design it away, because if you do that, it ruins the model. You've got interference. Essentially, it's treated as interference. The brain couldn't do that. It had to keep it. So it actually
Right.
made use of it. And guess what it's used for in brains? It's the mechanism by which novelty is handled. So you lose it, you lose novelty handling, which is the one thing, the one fault that has traced AI from day one. Everything that it wasn't trained on, you bring it in and it behaves weirdly. Right. So, and what's the definition of intelligence? The capacity to handle novelty autonomously. You bestowing a capability into a machine, gifting a capability to a machine is not intelligence. Autonomously acquiring a capability, this is like a definition of intelligence. So that's kind of the
So,
whole mechanism is right there.
so if I'm following, you'd grant that there are LLMs certainly have the capability to, achieve goals and arguably reason in a narrow set of problems. But if I'm understanding what you're saying that if they encounter something that is a entirely new phenomena, they do not have the ability to, I don't want to say experience, but to
Adapt.
contextualize, yeah, to adapt and come up with new learnings and new formalisms around this entirely new set of
Yeah.
phenomena or input. Is that a fair choice of words?
Yeah. Yeah. They can extrapolate from their underworkings, the stuff under the hood, but the extrapolations are ungrounded in the way that we are grounded in experience.
This is the
So
simple grounding
the
problem and the lack of a
yeah,
world
it's
model.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. So it's predictive. It's predictable that these models will have trouble finding accurate, well, finding accurate projections based on things that were never actually stimulated by. And there's no wonder they're drifting everywhere and they're unstable and they need correcting. So a human hand has to come out, and they call it alignment. Don't think that, think this, clunk, rip, rewire, and then all you've done is move the boundary of the error to some other place. So you've got an endless game of retrofitting fixes, and it's just endless. So we don't suffer from that.
Right. One really interesting thing that comes up to me is in my understanding of the science of consciousness, it's never placed as a causal agent in the world, right? So even though we um, everything that we observe and enter into the scientific literature enters conscious awareness, or just let's just say consciousness. Uh, it's not clear to me that if you gave a sufficiently advanced LLM a, a camera and a physical body and allowed it to explore the world, that it couldn't build a model of what it encountered, um, that was good enough that if it encountered a new, I'm not sure what would be novel enough to work in this example, but that it wouldn't have a world model sufficiently advanced to do everything that we would classify as intelligence, unless we, in my view, torture the definition of intelligence outside of what it's commonly held to be. Is that a fair statement? Am I missing something there, or is the
Yeah, well, that sounds like the traditional argument of computer science. You know, if I have a sufficiently detailed description of X, then for all intents and purposes, I have replicated X in relation to intelligence, it being a kind of informational processing um, uh, system. The problem is in the words sufficiently detailed. The way I think that the amount of information that is lost when you throw away the physics, the field system, is like, I don't know, 8 orders of magnitude, 1 part in 100 million survives. When you reduce everything down to a voltage spike and say that's the property that underpins intelligence, you've actually disposed of nearly all of the actual physics and the information content that exists in the field system. So it's extravagantly complex field system in space and in time. You know, it's specified in space and in time down to the nanometer, and its structure in space is operating at that level. And the great bulk of the information is actually thrown away. And if you were to try and describe all of that in a model of it, imagine a planet converted into a computer. It wouldn't even come close to capturing all of the information that we actually get, that comes to us for free in the form of subjective experiences, that allows us to navigate, not perfectly, we make mistakes all the time, but even we make mistakes, and we've got all this information. And we have a scientific method which allows us to optimally deal with misdirection that comes from our own experiences. Cognitive biases, they're called. And so I think that the large language model approach and computing in more generally has underestimated the amount of information and the modeling that's required to actually replicate human intellect. And the definitive and verifiable exemplar of a general intelligence that we can use to calibrate the lack of all that information is actually the scientist, for whom it is the job to encounter things that have never been encountered before by humans. That's our job. We're at the frontier of the known. By definition, we're required to do that. And with the models that are being used at the moment, you throw away the great bulk of the information in the brain, and then expect it to act like or replicate the behavior of a system like the human brain, which has access to like 8 orders of magnitude more information. And lo and behold, it struggles. I mean, it does some pretty amazing things, but the definitive, like the sentinel of its failure that's verifiable, is that you will never build an artificial scientist with a computer. That's the thing. And the reason is that the computer literally disposes of the mind part, the subjective part that guides
and
us.
this is the bit that's really interesting to me because it sounds, and I may be misinterpreting you here, but it sounds as though this places consciousness itself as a causal agent in the universe, which is something that I think many would say it's the example of a philosophical zombie, which is imagine someone that behaves as
Yeah.
humans do, but are not conscious. Or there's nothing it's like to be them. They're moving through the world as zombies. They don't feel pleasure or pain. Um, that 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 would still be a succinct and cogent explanation, or you could imagine that happening and nothing's lost. I'm completely agnostic and naive as to whether or not consciousness is plays some causal role, because it certainly, in my felt experience, seems as though it plays a causal role. The things of which I am conscious of certainly impact what I'm able to think about and do in a way
Yeah.
that the things that I'm not conscious of never can. Uh, how do you parse that, and whether consciousness is purely it plays no deterministic role, or actually it's integral to understanding the behavior of animals, humans, conscious creatures, and the decisions that they make, and without it, something would definitely an ability of
Yeah.
theirs would be lost.
Would disappear. Yeah. Okay. Well, this argument about the causal, the relationship between consciousness as a causal agent has a solution in the electromagnetic field approach, because the causality is actually fundamental physics. I mean, the causal, everything that happens in the brain is a result of what's called the Lorentz force, which is the force that the electric and magnetic field, they influence charge carriers, and all the signaling is based on that, the operation of that force. But under the two signaling mechanisms, the spiking that simultaneously generates the production of a field system that influences remotely, both of those things are all Lorentz force. So yeah, if you connect the production of that physics mechanism and connect it to consciousness, then it's connected directly to a causal agent, that is the electromagnetism. Now that would be moment to moment throughout everything, but that's not an indicator of the necessity for it in intelligence. What I think would be the key signifier of a causal agency is in the agency responsible for adaptation to novelty. In other words, as time goes on, the brain that, like at the end of this sentence, the brain that Colin had is not quite the same brain that Colin
Mm,
had at the start of the sentence. There's
hmm
literally atoms and molecules that are moved, and even synaptic spines that have undergone a bit of tuning. If that adaptation um, originates in spiking, then there you have a verifiable mechanism for connection of consciousness with a causal agency. In other words, you wouldn't adapt in the manner that you have adapted were it not for a mechanism that produced consciousness. So it's sort of, and if you allow conscious experience to be a feed choices in behavior, you go between A and B,
mm.
and you've got to make a choice and you choose B, then you've got a causal mechanism. It's indirect, but it's got explanatory efficacy, and none of the other theories actually have that built into them. And it also goes back in evolution. I mean, in your show notes, you mentioned a connection back down through evolutionary mechanisms. Well, this cellular membrane physics mechanism takes us all the way back to pond slime, right? Lipid, fatty layers on water that form the original formation of cellular material would have this physics built into them, and everything follows from there. So the potential for subjective qualities based on the use of electromagnetic effects as an originator of conscious experience travels back in time all the way to the potential acquired in very thin layers of lipids in decaying material,
Right.
rotting material in the early life on Earth. So this theory of consciousness would posit that it could be very likely be like something, to be even a single cell organism, or say a paramecium or something, light, dark, hot, cold,
Hmm.
acidic, non-acidic, salty, not salty. These gradients could have a subjective quality, a very primitive subjective quality that would be directly associated with living or dying. If I go the wrong way in response to a saline gradient, I die.
Mm.
But if I go the right way, I associate an experience of the right way with survival. So I get to reproduce, and everything reinforces. So you end up with more than one cell, and then you end up with more complex life and so forth. And in the end, if you wait long enough, you end up with two guys arguing about it on a video screen.
Wow, that's one of the most that's one of the most fascinating explanations I've heard for the evolution of consciousness, because most of the time that I hear it referenced to, it's in the way where it's necessary to pull together enough information about the environment in one place to make decisions for life or death, and therefore has a selection pressure associated with it. But the the bit that's new to me is that the actual experience itself could uh, have a causal feedback loop in the brain, such that the brain would adapt to the information that is being coalesced by is it fair to say, the multiple interacting EM fields?
Yeah, yeah. There's, I mean, in the article that I published in 2014, I called them virtual bosons. So the moment of triggering of a transmembrane physics event that produces these fields is actually equivalent to the arrival of a non-existent boson that interferes with the field system in the membrane. And that in itself, that is actually the moment that does everything. And all you have to do is say, if it's like something, to be that piece of matter undergoing that transition, then you've got a place to start. And I think that's where we should focus our attention. I can't claim to have proved it. It will require my chips to be built in order to do that. But the information content that arises from those mechanisms happening in our brains in their trillions, is the information content that causally results in us making choices, at the most sophisticated level, choices in science about whether or not nature works in a particular way according to certain formalisms.
And because I guess I'm sadistic and I want this conversation to have as many cans of worms open simultaneously as possible, based
So
on what
many.
you just said, I want to ask a question, maybe not, maybe leave it surface level as much as that's possible, which is, given the choices that you just specified, right, is it possible for the system to use the information that is aggregated together in consciousness at a given point to inform its choices and survival, without true quote unquote free will being a thing, right? Does that survive an explanation of the universe without free will?
Yeah, you really do know how to pick your tins of worms. They're
We're
this
swimming in them
particular
at this point.
tin. Yeah, I know. It's a free will is. I'm actually happy to let someone else sort out the free will thing. But what I perhaps would like to see the listener focus on is an aspect of free will which tends not to be thought about that much. And a moment ago, I described a process of my changing brain, um, and it's changing on a moment-to-moment basis. So if I act, and for whatever reason, if I act, make a choice, um, the Colin that comes about as a result of that choice is not the same Colin. So when you say free will, the choice moment itself is actually a moving object in time and in space in our brains. So the
Hmm.
question is actually, I think the question is the wrong, I would say poorly posed, ill posed, because it assumes that there's a static brain that undergoes choice
Hmm.
and moves through time like that. But that actually doesn't happen.
Right.
And
Okay. That's
in reality, there is a formal, relatively modern, emergent phenomenon in science called complexity theory. And our brains are like complexity in spades. You know, it's
oh
really
yeah,
an
right on that
entirely complex,
verge of
adaptive
chaos.
thing. So the free will problem, I think, will get its resolution in whatever form it is in that discussion, the narrative around the complexity of the brain. But I would highlight the fact that the brain is continually morphing in space and in time,
There
and
is
that
no static
the
self always making the
yeah,
decision from an unchanging
yeah,
place. Yeah.
yeah. So I that's my way of cautiously approaching that particular worm packet and putting it back on the shelf for
Thank you.
somebody
No,
else to fight with.
I think that's the most elegant way you could have tackled that can of worms. Thank you.
Yeah,
And it also is nice because, well, it ties up a lot of questions that were appearing in my mind, following
yeah,
the description of life using the information
yeah.
aggregated by
You're
consciousness.
asking all the right questions. You know, like it's good to hear. I wish that there were others in science that had, more directly in science anyway, that had as detailed a grip on things.
Well,
Asking the right questions is key to everything.
it's an absolute treat to talk with someone that's spent decades really mulling over many of the same things and being so swimming in these
Mm.
same pools of worms.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
well, at this
Had
point,
enough?
is there anything that you think that has been left unsaid that you'd like to discuss? I guess I have one last question, which is, um, I I have a prediction for what you'd say, but it's probably wrong. When a 2D or 3D X chip art, replica of the brain, an inorganic replica of the brain, has successfully been created, um,
Yeah.
how would the fact that it is conscious be verified?
Oh, you've done it again. You know, you're asking the right question. Peter and I are making, when we get asked, we tell, you won't tell anyone, will you? What we
Oh,
say is that we are building intelligent machines. We don't actually mention the C word. We're building intelligent machines. So imagine we go ahead and we build these chips. We get enough money. It's going to need billions to probably do it properly. And we build a machine, very primitive machine, let's say like C. elegans, which is a 1-inch round worm, or flat worm, I can't remember now. 300 neurons equivalent. It makes primitive decisions. So we've got a robot that's moving. My prediction about where the moment consciousness begins to become possibly explainable will be the moment in the lab where we get these machines working and we surround them with stimuli and expect decisions to be made in which the exact same stimuli are applied and a different decision is made. And you ask the question, where did the information come from for that decision to firstly, A, be chosen, and secondly, causally interact with the world? And we're going to stand there and go, that was unexpected. Where did it get that information from? That's the moment that I probably won't see. But someone in the lab with this chip technology will be on the landscape of that potentiality. And all I want to do is start the process of creating that potentiality. So that, I think, is the moment that, the aha moment that you see written about in science, where they see something and that, wow, why did it do that? And then something happens and they realize they've opened a door into a complete new area. I think that's what it's going to look like. in the behavior of this stupid, dumb robot trundling around in some experimental space, apparently able to behave in a certain way, unpredicted by any of the information we think we've given it. And yet there's more information there somehow. And it's chosen intelligently to act in its own interests, spontaneously to do something that was unpredicted. And that is how it will look. So Peter and I, we don't mention that outcome. We just say we're going to create these machines, and we reckon they're going to adapt like natural fauna. Fine. And then we wait. And then what we're waiting for is for somebody in the outside world to come in. You know those chips you made? I'm in the science of consciousness, and I think I'd like to explore how consciousness might invoke itself in your machines. Would you mind if we use your chips? And we'll go, thought you'd never asked. I thought you'd never ask. And because it came from outside us, I think it will get legs and move. And I just want to engender that process with our devices. In the next year or so, I'm hoping to be able to cobble together a few of these devices and just explore how you would even begin to do it. And it's essentially the beginnings of trying to create a system that starts to exhibit chaotic behavior and complexity. Very small number of devices, and everything will go from there. Like I said, it will be quite a while. So if I had to assess the amount of intelligence in our machines at the moment, it's numerically 0, and it will stay that way forever unless we alter our thinking. Another article, oh God, somewhere in my book, there's a chapter on characterizing the difference between intelligent behavior and and stuff without intelligent behavior. And I characterize it by taking an arbitrary configuration of brain material in any human and calling it, that configuration has a set of all knowledge, K. So you've got K of time, a little mathematical thing. So let's say we bestow new knowledge, gift it, humans intervene, bestow new knowledge. So K was one thing, and it was K at a different time, different. And as a result, behavior changes. Let's say it was gifted to play chess. It starts playing chess, and it wasn't playing chess. So K of T, this mathematical thing, has changed. Now in maths, this is called decay dt. It's a rate of change of knowledge, right? But autonomously, the rate of change of knowledge in the original brain was 0. It wasn't changing at all. Humans intervene and gifted a capability. The autonomous thing that we do is to learn chess ourselves is not there. So if you autonomously acquire new knowledge, that's the sign of intelligence. So my way of characterizing intelligence is that it's actually a small matrix multiplication where intelligence is a product of both K, what knowledge you have, and another term involving the rate of change of knowledge that exists fundamentally, already built in. In other words, it's predisposed to change given new information, not waiting around for somebody to dump it in. And what I think is that if this was K and this was decay dt, everyone's got this one set to 0. In other words, there's no autonomy. The intrinsic rate of change of knowledge is 0. And intelligence is actually a product of both of these things. At some level, you have to have enough knowledge to know how to acquire new knowledge. So there's a small amount of that, but there's another amount, in other words, non-zero amount of autonomous decay dt, rate of change of knowledge. And that's gone from everything we've done. Human intervention, even an adaptive, like we teach it, we give it source data, the data set, training set. We're force feeding this model with all this data. That's not an example of autonomous knowledge acquisition. So it's got the second one, decay dt, set to 0. It's just force feeding knowledge, and that's not intelligence.
So I'm curious
So
if
that in my way of characterizing it.
right, and that makes sense to me. But if we limit K to just playing chess, then like DeepMind was fed plenty of a little bit of training data, but mostly, well, like what was revolutionary there was it was mostly just the rules of chess, and then told to go play chess, and it effectively generated its own training data by playing it, itself and exploring the relationships in chess. Is that
Yeah.
fundamentally different? Like if that same thing could be applied to, every domain that AI is currently being applied to and will be applied to in the
Yeah.
future. I understand the distinctions we've made up till that point, but uh, is that learning in the same way that you're talking about, or is
Well,
it different?
perhaps I could rephrase it in this way. I ask you to make a choice between two machines. Machine one has superhuman capability in 100 different areas. You can play chess, you can do you can analyze medical images, you can blah, blah, blah. We're all better than a human, a
Mm,
hundred of them, right? And then you bring in new information about totally new area, 101. Now, if it was actually intelligent, it would be able to encounter that new knowledge and create its own capability in this new area, right? So that would be uh, a machine that would have intelligence, and that's machine two. But the machines we make at the moment will sit there and try to map the new problem into 100 dissimilar domains and then project new knowledge in the form of some weird combination of all the junk that it's got. And it may or may not cohere with an actual capability 101. And it is likely that that will not happen. So in my world of machines, the first one, number one, has 100 times 0 intelligence, right? It's got capability coming out of every pore, if it
mm.
even has pores. And machine two could know nothing, absolutely nothing, no domains at all. It doesn't even know number one, but it's got the capability of acquiring number one on its own without our intervention, hands off, just by existing in an environment that's encouraging capability in area number one, and then two, and then three. So, the deep blue, you could put noughts, what do you call it in America? Noughts and crosses, tic-tac-toe,
Yeah, yeah.
in front of the chess computer, and it would sit there till the end of the universe and never come to grips with that, because humans actually told it how to think in chess terms and only chess terms and not anything else. So it's that distinction, that's the question that I'm asking you.
Hmm.
100 superhuman capabilities, 0 intelligence. Very useful machine, possibly faulty in certain ways that we'll never understand. Or machine 2, which has no knowledge whatsoever, but has an intrinsic capacity to create new capability on its own.
Hmm.
That's intelligence. So
So do
if I could
you,
encourage people to think like that, I think you'll make some progress.
yeah,
So,
that distinction makes a lot of sense to me. Do you think that there's a breakthrough point at which it has capabilities in enough areas that it can actually generalize and truly pick up, like learn a completely new area, just based on the aggregate of capability it already has because the laws
yeah,
of nature
I
generalize well enough?
yeah, I don't think so. Um, what that would require is for human beings to actually supply a capability. This is a capability to adapt its own capabilities based on knowledge that about things which even we don't know. So we can have a very sophisticated machine, but I would again predict that the one thing that is out of reach of that machine one is the ability to be a scientist, which is kind of what you're asking, to come up with, face novelty, uh, overcome the challenges the novelty produces, and come up with some useful characterization of it, requires information that the humans who built it don't actually have. So you actually have to have a formally accurate prescription for all novelty, which is a
Hmm.
contradiction in terms, because you don't know what novelty is there. The novelty you're talking about, you don't know about. So you can't tell it how to encounter the novelty. And you can have um, sufficiently unfamiliar novelty that would escape the boundary of the capability of the human limited model of all novelty. Right? It's like just like machines that can, like the deep mind people that created a machine that could do all video games.
Mm.
You know, we all the novelty that can turn up is actually within the grasp of the humans who built it, and so it has a gifted level to acquire new video games. But ask it to make a cup of tea, and you know you're in trouble. Cups of tea don't map into the space of video games in any obvious way, uh,
Sure.
and so the way to detect the problem is just the extent of the dissimilarity of what you give it versus everything it's already been programmed to accommodate.
Right. How well it
So,
generalizes to the novelty.
yeah. So if you think that you're just
Interesting.
going to, that 10,000, a million superhuman capabilities equals AGI, I would suggest no. And the reason is because the novelty in the universe that a scientist is required to encounter, deep novelty, the boundary where that occurs just stays one step away from you. And so there will be strange behavior that doesn't match human in ways that are hard to predict, you know, which has
Interesting. Well,
proven
if
to be troublesome in my automation, for example.
right.
Machines that misbehave when something happens that wasn't predicted have created all manner of grief in my
Right. Well,
original work in industry.
we're certainly seeing our fair share of that today. And if things move as
Yeah,
fast as the current, AI engineers at the labs are saying, we might see whether it's true or we just lose sight of it and they generalize well enough given 10,001
yeah,
capabilities
yeah.
that
I know. I mean,
we're
you've
like,
got to.
maybe it can, and we don't know until, we uncover new
Yeah,
physics and it just totally falls flat on its face.
yeah. Yeah, well, my prediction is that the boundary of that where the capabilities fail will fail in opaque ways, unpredictable ways, that of which the machine itself is absolutely certain. It has no doubt at all that this behavior is the correct behavior. It's where the machine that can doubt and doesn't know and knows that it doesn't know. That's the machine to find, and we
Mm,
haven't found those machines yet. So I think the way this is, they're going to invest trillions of dollars making robots and all they robots that simply push the boundary of ignorance to an acceptable place. I will not get in a driverless vehicle that's let loose in an arbitrary environment, for example. No way. That
you're not
prospect
taking it
just
to the
frightens me.
the the outback of Australia in a Waymo.
Well, no. I mean, Volvo tried it here, and they had this brilliant self-driving car. Took it to South Australia, and the kangaroo hopped across the road, and it didn't know it was there. You know, it's exactly the problem. I mean, it's actually more serious than that. Driverless vehicles that have encountered roadworks a couple of years back killed 3 people,
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
right?
The
Because the set of all possible roadworks wasn't part of the training set.
Mhm.
So
It is.
define all possible roadworks. You know, you can't do it. It's
Yeah.
pretty simple.
Right. It gets to be a really interesting question, in my opinion, because statistically, in the environments they're currently driving in, like driverless vehicles are safer in deployment and in the more rigorous
Yeah,
testing are like maybe an order of magnitude safer at this point, but like a death
yeah,
at the hands of a driverless car is just so much more inflammatory than, a death caused by
absolutely.
a
Which is the
human. So,
reason driverless vehicles are successful in highly controlled domains with well-defined boundaries and where all of the incidental events have been catered for. And even then you get weird behaviors. And these are precisely the things that humans deal with guess what? Human experience that provides them with information and choice that these machines just don't have. And
mm,
they're brilliant machines. I'm not denigrating them at all. They're amazing technology, and the incredible things they do is just blows me away.
mm,
But they're not this. And the boundary, if the listener takes one message away, if you want to test the machine's boundary, find the thing that it's never dealt with and look at what it does. And that's where that's the Achilles heel. Not what it's seen in the past, everything that it hasn't seen is the first thing you go for to test it to destruction.
right.
There you go.
Awesome.
Had enough? Because I
Thank you.
think I'm running out of voice.
I've had some water to drink as we go, but this was a treat. Thank you so much for this. This has been a real joy.
It's an absolute pleasure. I probably should have done things like this long ago, but there you go. Thank you for asking. I appreciate the kindness with which you approached this whole thing. And
Oh,
I
and
wish
you and the same to you and the generosity of your time. I hope that
yeah,
your research gets the funding and the attention that I feel it deserves. And
well,
if people want to get in contact more with you or your work, are there places you would direct them? Perhaps your book or somewhere online?
look, if you go into Google Scholar and type my name, Colin G. Hales, you'll get most of my publications. Um, and also there is a thing called ResearchGate where you can find lists of things. But email me if you want to talk. That's all I can
Yeah, yeah.
say.
Could we
You'll
get
find
the
me.
name of your
Try.
your book one more time if people are interested in your work and
Oh, it's called The Revolutions of Scientific Structure. That's the full exposition of the change to science that I had to construct in order to understand why I was apparently unable to do what I was doing and why it hadn't been done before. And yeah, it's not an easy read. I'm sorry, I can't help it.
awesome. Well, thank
Yeah,
you, Colin. I'm sure I'll be reaching out at some point in the future to help clarify my thinking
yeah.
on developments that happen in the
Anytime.
various 3 or 4 letter acronym theories
Yeah,
of consciousness. And I really appreciate your time
yeah.
today.
A pleasure, absolute pleasure. Thank you, and good luck everyone with all this material. Enjoy.
These these cans of worms.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers.